Hello, and welcome to a very special Halloween episode of Scattered Terrain. My name is Meredith, and today I'm going to be showing you how I make my ghost minis.
Here's what you're going to need. Some large and small paper clips, something to base the mini on, a pair of needle nose pliers and some wire cutters, a marker, some super glue and baking soda, tissues. Then depending on which style of ghost you're making, you'll want some beads to use for the head, or you'll want some little heads. You'll also want anything you normally use to base your minis, some basic painting supplies, and you'll want to have some washes on hand. Alternately, you're going to need some paint so we can make our own wash. You're also going to need some white paint. I find it much easier to use a spray can for this. And finally, you're going to need some 50-50 mixed PVA and water. I'm going to start with making the basic frame ghost. You're going to want to start by grabbing one of your large paper clips, and then I'm just going to bend it open here and lay it along my ruler. And we want our head to be 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to take the half with the small loop and line it up at 1/4 of an inch and mark that out on either side of the loop. Then from that mark, I'm going to measure 1 inch down for the body. Finally, I'm going to mark out another 1/4 of an inch beyond that. That gives us our stand. Then I'm going to grab the wire cutters, and making sure that I'm holding on to both halves, I'm going to cut at that final mark, and then I'm also going to cut at the first mark. This gives us a ghost that's just about the same size as a 28mm mini. Now I'm going to use the other half of that paper clip to give us the next size up. So on this loop, we're going to line it up with the 3/8 of an inch mark instead of 1/4 of an inch, and mark that out on both sides. And then this guy's going to be taller, so we're going to go 1.5 inches down from that 3/8 mark. And then that amount that we have left at the end is what we'll use for the stand for this guy. So we'll grab those wire cutters again and snip it at that first mark. Then to give us our largest ghost, we're going to grab one more large paper clip and bend it open. And I'm going to try and give myself as straight a line as I can. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you don't want it to be too bent. And then for the head on this guy, we want it to be a full 1/2 inch. So we're going to take the smallest loop and line it up 1/2 inch up and mark both sides. And then this guy is even taller still, so we're going to be going down a full 2 inches before marking the bottom of the body. Then we're going to mark 1/2 inch beyond to give ourselves a stand. And once again, we're going to grab the wire cutters and cut at the first and last marks that we made. Now that we have all of our wires cut to length, we're going to grab the needle nose pliers and bend them into shape. So we just need to take our 2 marks for the bottom of the head and bring them together. Just like so. Then I'm going to grab that loop and bend it forwards. That way later when we drape the ghost, his hood will hang very dramatically and hide the fact that he doesn't have a face. You want to also make sure to bend the entire body forward slightly. And then once you're happy with that angle, we're going to flip the ghost over, and I'm going to line my pliers up exactly with that line that we made for the base. Then just bend your frame straight up against it, and it creates your stand. And then I'm just going to give it a quick test run here and make sure I like the angle he stands at. It's a little far forward. Yeah, there we go. That's what I'm going for. And then you're going to complete this exact same process with your 2 larger sizes, trying to make that head as round as you can. And then once you're happy with your loop, you want to bend him forward and give him that curved posture so that he'll be looming over our players. Then you're going to flip him over, grab hold of that stand, and whoop, keep hold of your actual frame here. And just bend that stand to be about a 90-degree angle away from your frame in any direction. Give him a quick test, make sure we like it. And once you're happy with him, move on to the largest frame and do exactly the same thing. Just bring your 2 marks for the head together. Make sure you've got it nice and round. Then bend that head away from the body. Give him a little bit of a forwards arch. And bend up his stand. Then for this basic frame style of ghost, we're going to be adding arms. So going back to the smallest frame, which is going to give us the ghost of a medium-sized creature, we're going to line up the stand with the bottom of our ruler, and then we're going to measure up 7/8 of an inch and make a mark for the arms. And then for our ghost of a large-sized creature, we're doubling all of our dimensions, so that means when you line up the base, our mark for our arms is going to be at 1 3/4 of an inch. Now, you could also measure down from the neck. On the smallest mini, that's going to be at 1/8 of an inch. At the largest mini, that's going to be at 1/4 of an inch. So we're going to grab our middle-sized ghost and line him up with the neck, and go down 3/16 of an inch to hit that midway point between our two. Next, we're going to need to cut the wire for the arms. So we're going to go ahead and grab one of our small paper clips now and bend it open the same way we did the large one. Now this time, instead of going for a specific length of wire, I'm just going to take the paper clip and lay it perpendicular to my measuring line. And I'm going to just carry across where the paper clip ends to both sides. That way when we come back with the wire cutters and trim on those marks, we wind up with 2 even U-shapes. And you always want to make sure that you're holding on to both sides of whatever it is that you're cutting. That way you don't send something flying across the room. As you can see here, this gives us the arms for our small and medium ghosts. Then we're going to grab one more small paper clip. And this time we're going to open it up as a sort of a heart shape. But this still leaves one side a little bit too short, so I'm actually going to bend this open a little bit further, just like this. And then I'm going to line that paper clip back up with my measuring line, and I'm going to put it so that the V looks fairly equal on both sides of my line. Then I'm going to make a mark right before the wire starts to bend into that final U shape, and I'm going to match it to the other side. Then just grab the wire cutters and trim on both marks. To attach the arms, you're going to want to grab your baking soda and superglue. You want to put a small drop of superglue just below the black mark that you have for the arm position. This will give us something to lay the arms against and keep them from moving out of place. So you want to grab your frame, and on the back, put a drop of superglue just below the line where the arms go. Then sprinkle a little baking soda onto this superglue, and it will instantly become a nice hard little spot that you can now rest the arms against. Next, we need to shape the arms. So grabbing hold of our cut wire, we're going to use the needle nose pliers to grip just the very ends and bend them downwards to make hands. Then I'm going to pinch it just about the middle of the wire and bend it up to make the elbows. Then you just want to give a little bit of a pull and twist to this to give a sort of unique shape to each miniature's arms. Then grab the main wire frame for your body, and you can rest the arms up against that little rock of superglue that we made. Now when you hold your frame at a slight angle to get the arms where you want them, they don't slide out of place. Once you have them in a position that you're happy with, put a little bit of superglue right over the top and sprinkle some more baking soda to immediately lock everything into place. Then flip the frame over, add a little bit of superglue to the other side, and repeat your baking soda once more. That way you're sure they're not going to go anywhere. Then we're going to move to the next size up and repeat this exact same process, grabbing the wire for the arms, gripping the very end and bending them down into hands, gripping at the halfway point and bending them up into elbows, and then tweaking them into a nice unique shape. Then grab your wire frame, put a little drop of superglue on the back, right below where that black line is, and sprinkle on your baking soda to harden it immediately. Then position your arms where you want them up against that lump. Oh, and be careful you don't tip too far back. And as you can see here, the drop of superglue that I put on the frame isn't big enough to hold my arms in place. So at this point, you can just add some superglue and hold the arms where you want them. After about 30 seconds, you can let go and sprinkle on a little bit of baking soda to lock everything down. And then just add more superglue and baking soda to both sides to make sure you have a good firm bond. And moving to the very largest ghost, it is the exact same process, gripping the very ends of the arms to bend down, bending up at the halfway point for the elbows, and giving it that tweak, putting the drop of superglue on the back and firming it up with baking soda, and then dangling our arms into place and locking them down with more superglue and baking soda. Then our final step for this style of ghost frame is going to be to secure it to a base. And for my two smallest frames, since they both are considered medium-sized creatures, that means putting them onto a 1-inch base. Now you always want to give yourself a quick test fit first to make sure that the mini's going to stand where you want it to. With this style of ghost frame, you're going to want to put it near the edge of one side so that the floating ghost that's bent forward is going to suspend itself somewhere right over the center of the actual base. Then once you're happy with where it's going to sit, you just put a little bit of superglue onto your base, position your mini's stand into the puddle of superglue, and sprinkle baking soda over the top to lock everything down quickly. And we'll just blow off our excess baking powder here. And if he still has a little bit of a wiggle, add a touch more superglue from the front and lock that down with baking soda too. And that guy is ready for the next step. So then I'm going to grab my other mini that sits on a 1-inch base and follow this exact same process. So we'll add our superglue, sprinkle our baking soda over the top. Oh, and sometimes when you go to dust off the extra, he's not quite stuck down yet. If this happens, no worries. I'm just going to put him back into the little divot in my glue here, add a little bit more superglue, And then this time I'm gonna hold it in place and wait just a minute before I put the baking soda on. Really give everything a chance to sort of soak in. All right, he looks good. And finally, for our largest ghost, I'm gonna grab a 2-inch base and then follow the exact same procedure of giving myself a nice dry fit, making sure he'll be centered, and locking him in place with super glue and baking soda. And that gives us 3 sizes of the basic ghost frame. Then we'll just clean up this baking soda here. The second ghost I'm going to show you how to make today is what I'm calling the classic ghost. So once again, we're going to start with a large paper clip, and then we're going to bend him open into a V shape. Now this time when we line our small loop up on the ruler, we're going to put a mark at the first point that it is straight after the bend. Then we're going to mark down 1/4 inch. Then from that 1/4 inch mark, we're going to go down 1 inch for the rest of the body and make our next line. And then for our base, we're going to make a line around the corner of the next bend as soon as it gets back to the straight. Then we're going to use our wire cutters to clip it at that first and last mark. And that right there is why you should be holding on to both ends. Then we're going to grab the other half of our paper clip, and we're going to try and straighten him out as best we can. Give myself a bit of an easier time here, use the needle nose pliers. There we go. Now lining up that nice clean cut mark that we made with our starting point, our first mark is going to be at 1 7/8 inch. And then we'll go another 3/8 inch below that to make the mark for our stand. Then use the wire cutters to cut that final mark we made, and grab one more paper clip for our third and largest classic ghost. So when you bend open this paper clip, once again you're going to try and get as straight a line as you can. Then you're going to put that wire against our measuring line, and our first mark is going to be right after the curve as soon as the wire becomes straight again. Then going from that mark, our second mark is going to be at 2.5 inches up. Then grabbing our wire cutters, we're going to cut at our first mark, then flip over and cut right before the curve on the other end. Then once you have your wire marked and cut, we're going to use the needle nose pliers to bend the base to a 90-degree angle away from our main stem. You don't want this guy to be leaning at all. He's going to be straight up and down. And I just give him a quick test fit here, make sure he stands up straight, and then move on to our next one. Grab right at that mark and bend straight up. And tweak it, make sure he really is at a 90-degree angle, and do the exact same thing for our third and final ghost. Clipping right at the mark and bending up. Then for the head of these ghosts, we're going to use round beads. I have 3 different sized beads to give me 3 different sized heads. So once again, we're going to grab our baking soda and super glue, and this time I'm going to start by filling the center of the bead with baking soda. Just scoop some in and push it in with your finger. It doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm just going to do a quick test fit of my post and make sure I can slide it all the way through the bead. And then I'm going to put a drop of super glue into the space that the post just cleared. Then slide the post into place and push until you can just see the wire about to come through the other side. Like this. And this is the exact same process for all 3 sizes of classic ghost. Just fill the bead with baking soda, test fit your piece of wire, fill the space with super glue, and push your wire through until it's just about to poke out. And the process is virtually identical with the largest ghost as well. On this one, it's just a question of the hole in the bead may be a bit larger, so you may need to make sure that your wire is actually pressed up against the side of the bead inside as opposed to just putting it straight through the center. Once all of the heads are glued into place, we just glue these frames onto their bases. Now, this time when we glue onto the base, we don't want it to be offset. We want to make sure that our post is coming up from the very center of the base with these ghosts. So you just test fit the frame onto the base, make sure you've got it nice and centered, and then holding your frame where you want it, drizzle that super glue over the end and sprinkle it with baking soda. Once you give it a second to set, tap off the excess and set him aside. And just as with the previous ghosts, my middle-sized ghost is still considered a medium creature, so he's also going to go onto a 1-inch base. Just make sure he's centered, give him the super glue and baking soda treatment, and he's ready for our next step. And we're going to move up to a 2-inch base for our final ghost, as this is going to be a large-sized creature. And so just make sure that he is nice and centered, and just make our nice little crisscross of super glue over the top. Make sure we're locking it down from both sides, and then give it a dash of baking soda. And that completes our frames for the classic ghost. Now the third variation of ghost I'm going to show you is a combination of the first 2. So I'm going to call this one the basic bead. You're going to start by trimming your wire and adding a bead to the top exactly as you would for the classic ghost. And then you're going to cut arms out of your small paper clips exactly like you would for the basic ghost. Then you're going to use your needle nose pliers to give each frame that slight lean forward. And we're going to use the super glue and baking soda to put a little spot on the back to hold up our arms. Then, just as we did with our first ghosts, we're going to dangle the arms against our little stop and then add our super glue. Make sure we like where it's positioned and sprinkle baking soda to lock it in place. And if you're worried about knocking too hard against the piece that you're holding, instead of tapping the actual object, you can tap the back of your hand, and it's a slightly more gentle way of shaking off the excess. And once again, we're going to follow the exact same steps for our medium and large-sized ghost frames. If you're enjoying the video so far, I'd greatly appreciate it if you hit that like button. It helps YouTube promote my video to more people. Oh, and sometimes even when you're tapping on the back of your hand, it is still a little too rough and it'll pop the piece right off. Just press him back into place, hold him still for a second, and he should reattach. And then I just like adding a little bit of extra super glue to make absolutely sure he's secure. And before we do any more tapping, I'm gonna go ahead and super glue him from the front as well. And once you've got him coated from both sides, those arms really shouldn't go anywhere. And then you want to base these guys exactly the same way that we based our basic ghosts. The fourth variation I'm going to show you uses a carved bead for the head. In this case, I'm going to use a skull. Other than the fact that the bead is carved with the shape of a face or a skull on it, we're going to follow the exact same steps as our basic bead frame. So we have our wire that's cut to the length of the classic ghost and the arms from our basic frame. Now, because this bead is fairly heavy and it has a good sized hole, I'm actually going to take a minute and make sure that my stick is positioned in such a way that I have direct contact against one side of the inside of the bead. Then I'm going to drizzle some super glue down over the top of that and fill baking soda in over the top. Then once that's set, I'm going to grab hold of the bead and make sure that the bottom of the wire is also touching against a side, and then fill in with super glue and baking soda to lock that down. As a final step, I'm going to flip it back over and fill that top opening with super glue and sprinkle baking soda over it to try and close up as much of the hole as I can. That way when we drape it later with the tissue, there won't be a dark circle where there's a hole. And you may need to do this more than once in order to get it level with the top. There we go, now he's got that nice domed skull. Then we put our drop of super glue right below where we want the arms and make it into a lump with our baking soda, dangle our arms into place, and lock everything down. And since he's cut to our large size, he's going onto a 2-inch base. Now sometimes if the bead that you're using is very heavy, it's going to cause your whole ghost frame to tip sideways. In order to prevent this and give him some extra strength, if you grab hold about halfway through your base wire, you can give it a tweak to one side or the other, and that helps give it a second axis of control and should make it impossible for it to pivot. Then once you've got that bend in place, just position him so that he'll be floating over the very center of his base and lock him in with super glue and baking soda. Now as you can see here, that super glue baking soda combo really has made a bit of a lump on our base where we're holding our stand up, and the basing material that I use lays pretty flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make several other odd shapes of super glue and baking soda on my base. That way later when I base them, the one lump from the stand isn't going to stand out so much. It'll look more like just a slightly uneven surface all the way across. Our fifth and final variation of Ghost Mini is using an actual mini head. So once again, we're going to start with a large paper clip and bend it open to be flat. Our first mark is going to be right after a curve where our wire becomes straight. Then we're going to mark up 1/4 inch for our base, and then another inch beyond that for our body. Then once again, we're going to use our wire cutters to clip the first and last mark, giving us 2 ghost frames out of every paper clip we use. Then as with all our other frames, we're going to grab right at the mark for our base and bend our wire up. And with this frame, you do want to give the wire that slightly forward curl. Do the same with my other one here. There we go. And you'll cut arms off of a small paper clip exactly the same way we did with our basic ghost. So starting with my little mini skull, if I flip it over, you can see here that there's a little indent where it's meant to be put onto its spine. This is where I'm going to attach it to my wire. So holding in between 2 fingers, I'm just going to fill that little reservoir with super glue. And then I'm going to dip my paperclip into the baking soda before I then press it into place. This will help it to harden a little bit faster, but it's not going to be an instant bond, so you do want to make sure that you hold it for a moment. All right, then give it a quick check and make sure the head's at the angle you want it. Then once you're happy with the angle, put a nice line of super glue between the wire and skull across the back and cover it in baking soda. Then I'm gonna grab my little mini head, and as you can see here, I tried to find somebody who looked like he was angry or screaming. That way he'll be a nice spooky ghost. And flipping him to the underside, I'm gonna fill that little reservoir with super glue and then take my baking soda dipped wire and hold it in place. After about 30 seconds, once it's set enough that you can let go, give it a quick once over, make sure you like the angle he's at, and then once you're happy with him, we're gonna do the same thing we did with the skull, make a nice bridge of super glue between the two pieces on the back, and coat it in baking soda. And it's all right if you build up a little bit of a lump on the back of the head and neck area. With the draping of the tissue, we're not gonna see it. And once again, we follow the exact same procedure for getting those arms in place. Getting our nice little lump of super glue in place to hold our arms steady, dangling our arms where we like them, and locking everything down with the super glue and baking soda. And when you're done, he should look something like this. And then just as we did for all of our other minis that have the arms, we want to make sure to base him offset to one side so that he hovers over the middle of that 1-inch base. And I'm going to do exactly the same thing with this guy. Now that we have our ghost frame created and set up on its stand, I'm going to go ahead and base my mini exactly as I would any other. For me, that means using a fine grade of train ballast. So I'm going to grab my flocking boat and some matte Mod Podge, and as you can see here, I've got my mini all ready to go with those extra lumps of super glue and baking soda in place. Then I'm just going to go over the entire base with a nice healthy coating of this Mod Podge. Then I just give him a quick sprinkle with my train ballast from all sides. Make sure you don't have any gaps. Then I just tap off the extra and give him a quick once over to make sure that he has a nice clean ring around the base. All right, and then once your basing material's dry, go ahead and give your frame and basing a good once over with a white base coat of primer. Now from this point, there are a lot of different directions that you can go depending on the final result you're looking for. With the variations that I'm showing you today are basic ghost frame, classic ghost frame, and mini head ghost frame are going to be left just their basic white primer at this stage. The basic bead I'm going to turn into an elemental spirit, so I want him to have a sort of inner glow. This means I'm going to paint his frame with whatever color glow I'm wanting to create. So grab your painting supplies and paint. And using a damp brush to help your paint go further, just give the whole frame a good once over with your color. Oh, and it looks like I didn't quite put enough paint out. We'll just refill here. And you don't need to worry about painting onto the base at all. You just want to make sure that you get the main frame covered. All right, and then just set him aside to dry. Now for the ghost minis that I'm making with skulls, both small and large, I want to turn them into skeletal wraiths. So over the basic white primer, these guys are going to get a coating with a sepia wash. That'll give the whole frame and skull the effect of being made out of bone. And you want to make sure to focus on the face and really get the wash into those crevices so that you don't have any white showing through later. Really let the wash pool up into those empty eye sockets. And then just give a nice thorough coating with your wash all over the frame and make sure that you don't have any really bright white spots coming through. And again, you don't have to go all the way to the base, you just want to get most of the way down. As a side note, if you're using any of these Citadel washes, you want to make sure when you close them that you squeeze until you hear that click. At this stage now, all of our frames are ready to be draped. And I like to have 2 paper towels on hand, one wet and one dry. This way I can keep my fingers clean between pieces and make things a little bit easier to get a hold of. Then you're going to grab a tissue and start by tearing off any factory clean edges. You don't want to have that sharp, crisp line anywhere. So I'm just going to pinch my way down, tearing off little pieces to have that nice raggedy edge. And I'm also going to tear off this bit that has these little folds in it because those would look a little bit odd on a mini. Then I'm going to tear my tissue up into little strips and pieces to make everything easier to handle. Once you've started getting your fingers wet, tearing tissue into pieces becomes far more difficult. It's really helpful to have a bunch of pieces torn ahead of time. All right, and then once we have enough pieces torn up, we're going to grab our bottle of half and half PVA and water, And then I'm going to be taking one of the scrap pieces of paperclip from earlier, and I'm going to be using it as a tool to help me shape and tear the tissue. First, let's start by draping the basic ghost frame. I like to start with the sleeves. So the first piece of tissue I'm going to grab is going to be one of the longer thin pieces, and I'm going to lay the tissue along my finger and soak it in my PVA water mix. And then just use your finger to work that mixture around and make sure that it's really soaked in. Then peel the tissue off of your finger, wrap it around the back of your frame like a shawl, and then using your tool or your fingers, whatever's easiest, wrap it over the top of the arm on either side and pull gently downwards on it to make sure that it drapes. When you pull downwards, sometimes it's going to tear at the spot where it crosses over the wire. That's perfectly fine. Just take the piece that you pulled off, lay it over the top, and fold it down again. The more times that you rip it and tear it, it just helps to accentuate that tattered, worn look that really makes your ghost or spirit look creepy. Then I'm just going to make sure that it's not built up around the neck, make sure that I have it sort of rolled down around the shoulders. And I also want to go back and make sure that I force a couple of wrinkles in where it bends over the arm. You don't want it to be smooth. Then I'm going to give my fingers a quick rinse and dry on my extra paper towels here. Then you're going to want to take some of that extra tissue, roll it up into a little ball, soak it in our PVA and water, and then stick it through that little loop that we made for the head. Then grabbing our next piece of tissue, we're going to go ahead and soak it with the PVA while it's on our fingers. And then separate your fingers from each other so that you can lift the tissue out between them. You can also try soaking the tissue when it's flat against your plastic tray. I just find that it's much easier to get the tissue off of my finger than the plastic without having it tear. And then just drape the tissue in place over the top of your ghost's head and down the back, and position it to be sort of a veil. Your PVA water mix isn't going to dry for a very long time, so you've got a good amount of time to work with this and really play with it and sort of sculpt the way that your tissue is draping. And in places where it's difficult for your fingers to reach, don't forget that you've got that little tool to use so that you can really help to poke and prod at your folds until everything's draping the way that you like it. Once you've got the draping of the arms and hood in place, you then just want to keep using more tissues to work up your layers until your whole ghost is draped with enough that you like the shape that you're getting. I personally like having at least 3 layers of tissue. I find one of the main things that I focus on when doing my sculpting of this tissue is where the folds happen. As you can see here, I'm just using my fingernail to sort of force folds into the tissue where I want them. Now, I know a lot of people out there don't have long fingernails, and that is where your little paperclip tool is going to come in very handy. It can do just about anything your fingernails can. And you also want to keep in mind that if you only have a single layer of tissue anywhere, you're going to see through it very clearly to the white frame underneath. You can't really see it right now while everything is wet, but as this tissue dries, it becomes almost entirely translucent, so you can see through it really clearly. So I like going in and making sure that I have several layers over the arms as well as the head. This also helps you to pull it backwards and create that sort of phantom wind so that it looks like all of the cloth is sort of floating off in different directions or being blown back. One of the nice things with ghosts is that there really is no right or wrong, so just have fun with it and see what you come up with. If you get to the point where you've got all of your tissue on there and you absolutely hate it, just grab hold of the tissue and pull it all off and start over. Because it takes a long time to dry, there really is no point that you can't just pull it all off and begin again. Alright, and I'm starting to be happy with the look that I'm getting, so I'm just going to go back in with the tool and do a little bit of fine-tuning, pulling up in a couple of places, tearing a little bit, making sure that the folds fall exactly where I want them. Alright, and we'll give him a quick once-over. And I am very happy with how he's looking, so we'll just set him aside to dry. Next, we'll drape the classic ghost. This guy is definitely going to be the easiest, simplest ghost to make, and if you're worried about how this is going to go for you, I would recommend starting with this guy. So we're going to take a decent-sized piece of tissue that's roughly square, soak it on our fingers with that PVA white glue combination, make sure that it's all soaked in and we don't have any dry patches, and then center that square over the top of your frame and let it gently drape downwards. Then use your fingers very gently to pull down and sort of accentuate folds in a few places, like this. Then grab another piece of tissue, soak it in your PVA and white glue, Make sure that you don't have it at exactly the same angle as your first square, and drape it over as well. And use that same technique with your fingers to just tease the folds into the places that you want them. Alternately, if you've got big fingers or no fingernails, this is when you want to use that little paperclip tool to help you out. And keep in mind that when this dries, it's going to become much more translucent. So again, I like to put at least 3 layers of tissue. And with each layer, you just want to make sure you're teasing some new folds into place. That way you don't have all of the tissue laying flat against itself, and that helps you to have more rippled and rough edges. Then I like to go around and holding onto the top of the tissues with my finger against the bead to keep myself from pulling anything out of place, pinch at little sections around the edge, and you can tear off and create ragged edges. All right, now we'll give him a quick once over, see if we need to add any more here. Yeah, and you know what? He needs just a little more on top. So clean off our fingers, make things easier here, and grab a final smaller square. Soak it in our PVA, and do a final draping over the top. And when you know you're doing your final piece, you want to really take your time with it and make sure that it's laying exactly where you want it. Then on this guy, we're going to be doing that classic ghost look of the 2 holes cut in the sheet. And for this, I'm going to use a pencil as my sculpting tool. Now you want to make sure you use a dull pencil. As you can see here, it's got a nice rounded point. Then pick the side of your mini that you want to have be the face, and with a gentle twisting motion and pushing very slightly upwards, you want to press your 2 eyes into your mini. He should look something like this. And then we'll just set him aside to dry. For our basic bead ghost, you're going to want to drape him in exactly the same way that we did our basic ghost. Then for any ghosts that are made with either a carved bead for a face or an actual mini face, we're going to drape almost the same way that we did the basic frame and the bead head frame, but there's going to be a slight variation. I still like to start with a long strip of tissue draped around the back and across the arms to create those sleeves first. I find that that really helps to give the ghost its overall shape very quickly and makes it a lot easier to make my choices going forward. And just make sure if you've got too much tissue hanging down that you pinch hold of it and give it a good pull and tear off the extra. If you tear off too much, you can just drape it back over the top. And you want to make sure when you're draping over the arms that you give a good pull downwards at the bend of the elbow. You don't want the material to be floating up above where the actual arm is. It's when we get to putting on that hood piece that we want to be a little bit more careful. You want to start by positioning it over the front of the face to be sure that you're not draping it too far forwards. You want that face to be visible when we're done. And just as we did with all of the other frame drapings, you want to keep in mind that it's going to be very clear when it dries, and so the bones underneath are going to come through very clearly if you don't have enough layers. So I like making sure I have at least 2 or 3 layers everywhere. So I find it's easiest to get control over what I'm doing if the first cowl piece that I put on is very small, so that I can be very precise with exactly where it falls around the face. And then the next pieces that I put on are a little bit longer and will bridge that gap from the top of the head down the whole body to sort of create that flowy trail out behind the ghost. And from time to time, I like to make sure to push in around the shoulders from the back to create the definition between the head and shoulders and really sell that this is a figure. Now, if you're noticing that you can still see that front post while you're draping, one of the easiest ways I've found to cover it is to take one of your little squares of tissue, soak it with the PVA and water, and then gather the center up. And then use your little paperclip tool to press it into place below the head so that you cover that whole torso stick area. And then just take a minute and make sure that you are happy with how all of the folds around the face look and that you can see enough of the skull but not too much of the skull. All right, and it should look something like this when you're done. If there's anything about him that you're not happy with, now is the time to fix it. Once you're pleased with how he looks, go ahead and set him aside to dry. Once the mini has completely dried, it should look something like this. Now from this stage, we have a couple different options going forward. If you'd like, you can go ahead and base him in white again, and you'll wind up with an effect that looks something like this. Alternately, you can go ahead and just start applying washes as the next step, and then finish it off with a light dry brushing of white. That'll give you an effect like this. It really just depends on what you want your final ghost to look like. Let me give you just a quick side-by-side comparison of those two options. Give you a bit of an idea of what you'd be getting either way. There's also the option of going ahead with painting him white at this stage and then following up with the wash and dry brush. Here's what that would look like. For now, I'm going to go ahead and move forward with applying the wash to this guy. So I'm going to grab a green wash, and I'm going to use one of my fine point detail brushes. Give it a good soaking in the wash, make sure I've picked some up, wipe it off on the edge to make sure I don't have too much. And then you want to do sort of a pin washing technique of going in along all of the little folds and creases and trying to lay the wash along those parts. I like to focus on the very bottom edge as well to create a darker edge, lighter center if I can. And you don't have to be too precise with this. Really, if you just go over it with a lot of little strokes starting from the bottom and dragging up in random directions, it'll look just fine. I also like to make sure to focus a certain amount of wash around the face to indicate that maybe it has a little bit more of a glow or a concentration of its color in that area. And just work your way all over the ghost. Make sure you cross over the tops of the arms and all the way around the back. You want to be careful not to give it a completely uniform color, but to get a sort of streaky effect. And again, make sure you click that wash all the way closed when you're done. Then I'm going to grab my rough dry brush and just some basic white craft paint. Put a little bit of it on my fancy palette here. And then for the dry brushing, we're going to work a good amount of paint into the bristles of the brush and then wipe almost all of it out into the paper towel. I like to give it a quick test on the palm of my hand to make sure that I really do have the amount that I think I do in the brush. And then just go all over the ghost using a gentle downwards motion to strike at all the highest points of the tissue. I also like to do a little upward motion from the bottom to make sure that I'm catching the very edges of all of the little wispy bits. Since the ghost has an internal glow as opposed to an external glow, you don't have to just have a downward stroke with this dry brushing. You can really stroke from any direction. You just want to make sure that you're only hitting the high points and leaving all of that nice wash in the crevices. And anytime that you feel like you're having to start to push hard to get paint transfer, reload your brush, make sure to test it again in your hand before you touch your mini, and just give everything a good coating. All right, we'll give him a quick once over, make sure we don't have any spots that we missed. And you know what? This is all a little too subtle for me, so what I'm going to do is load up with a slightly heavier brush, and then I'm going to come back through and very selectively hit just a few key high points with that very bright white. All right, and then we'll check him over again, see if that looks better. Yeah, I think I like it. So we'll just go ahead and set him aside to dry. You can use this exact same technique using other colors of wash and other colors of dry brushing to create different effects, as you can see I did here for my skeletal wraiths. I just used the sepia wash exactly the way I did the green on the previous mini, and then I used a light mocha for my dry brushing instead of a pure white. Next, I'm going to move on to the ghosts that I did the pre-painting with a specific color. For this, I want the wash to match that same inner glow. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make my own wash. So you're gonna wanna grab that original paint color, a little cup of water, and a drop of dish soap. Then using the end of my paintbrush, I'm just going to stir that dish soap into the water here. And you don't have to worry about all of it coming off into the water. You just need enough that it's gonna make the wash run smoothly. And next we're going to add a dollop of our paint. I'm going to start with about this much. And just give it a good mix into our water and soap. Then once that's completely mixed in, we're going to give it a quick test and see if it's dark enough. And if you blow on the surface of your wash, all the bubbles will move out of the way and you can dip your brush in easier. So we'll just test a little on this paper towel here. Oh, looks like we got a little chunk of the paint that wasn't mixed in. Let's try that again. Just blow on the top here. All right, and so looking at the actual wash we've got, that is still a little pale for me. So we're gonna mix in just a little more paint and see what that gives us. Quick tip, always hold your cup while you're stirring it so that you don't knock it over. And just make sure that you really mix all of that pigment in. You don't wanna have any chunks sitting at the bottom slowly dissolving. And once you think that's pretty well blended, we're gonna test it again. All right, I'm much happier with how dark that is. So we'll just clean up our paint here. And then using this wash instead of the store-bought wash, we're going to follow the exact same technique that we have with our other washed ghosts. Just doing these thin trails of wash, starting from the bottom, working our way up, and making it look like the ghost has a glow from within. Now, I did find that my homemade wash tended to soak in and spread out more than the store-bought washes. So if you're looking to have very distinct color lines, you're going to want to make the wash stronger than I did so that you can use less of it. If you're enjoying this tutorial, consider subscribing. That way you won't miss out on any of my future content. And just make sure that you've gone over everywhere and that you don't have any spots that are obviously untouched. And then we'll just give him a quick once over here, make sure there aren't any obvious white spots that we missed. All right, he's looking good. And then I'm going to use this same wash technique in order to do the ghost minis that have faces. For most of the ghost, it's going to be exactly the same as it has been for our other washes, but it's going to be a little different when we get to the face. We want to make sure the features of the face stand out very strongly and that it's one of the most visible parts of the ghost. So in order to do that, we're going to use color for emphasis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab some of the original paint that I made the wash with, and I'm going to dip my brush into the paint and then wet it down slightly so that I'm not at full potency, and then use that to fill in all of the recesses on the face while I have him lying on his back. That way it really allows the wash to pool up into those deeper spots. But we don't want it to stand out too strongly or it might look like a mistake. So I'm going to use that same technique of taking a little bit of paint and dipping it in my water to put a couple of hot spots of color all the way around. That way his face isn't the only spot that's very vibrant. I always try and avoid doing anything in only one place. If you do something in one place, it might look like a mistake. If you do it in a couple of places or a little bit everywhere, suddenly it looks like you did it on purpose. All right, and then we'll give him a quick once over, make sure nothing jumps out at me. Yeah, he's looking good. And then once those have had a moment to dry, we're gonna grab our fancy palette and our white paint, load up a dry brush, empty it out into our paper towel, give it that quick test run on the palm of your hand to make sure you know how much paint you've got. And then just as we did before, we're gonna give a good once over all over the ghost from all directions, just hitting those very high points to really sell that inner glow. If you wanted to at this point, you could go with another color for your dry brushing or another shade similar to the one that you've got, but I like using white as my final dry brushing because it helps it to look more like a glow effect as opposed to a colored cloth. All right, he looks good. We'll set him aside to dry and do the exact same process to our mini with the face here. Just giving him a nice dry brushing of white all over. Make sure you're dry brushing around the edges of the folds and the high points of the face to really help him pop. And when you're done, he should look something like this. And for our final painting option, we're going to go to our classic ghost. Now, as you can see here with this ghost, it is very effective to paint him solid white right now, and it'll look a lot more like a sheet. But I find that I prefer keeping that translucent effect intact, and I like the way it looks here with just that dry brushing of white. So that's what we're gonna do. So we're gonna grab our fancy palette and our white craft paint, load up our dry brush, and this time we are going to focus on mainly doing a downward stroke, though on the very edges you do still want to go from the bottom up to really catch all those little wispy bits. To me, the look of just the white dry brush gives a much more ethereal, ephemeral quality where you can see all of the folds because the white paint is pointing out all of those edges, but you still have the translucent effect of the tissue. And once he's completely dry brushed, our final step is we're going to go ahead and fill in those empty eye sockets. So we're going to put a little bit of black craft paint onto our fancy palette, and then we're going to go back and grab that pencil that we used to push the eye holes in, dip the tip of the pencil into our black paint, and very carefully press it into the center of the eye holes to fill them with black. All right, and he's ready for the next step. Once you finish doing any painting, washing, or dry brushing to your ghost, it's time to make them look like they're floating. So once again, grabbing our fancy palette, we're gonna get a nice, smooth, wide brush and our black craft paint, and very gently we're going to color in the stick, starting at the bottom of the ghost and filling into the base. Now you do want to be very careful and work very slowly on this step because it is very hard to get the black off of your ghost if you accidentally touch it. So you want to just be very cautious and work slowly until you've covered all the way around the stick. And just give it a quick once over, make sure you have a good solid coat and that you didn't miss any spots. And go around and make sure that he's painted black all the way down to touching the base. Then once you've finished painting the stick in black, go ahead and finish painting out your base however you normally do so. For me, I paint all my bases to match the basic gray rock of my dungeon tiles. So that means starting with a base coat of gray. Once that's dry, I'm going to move to my next step, and to make it easier, I'm going to put my mini onto one of my homemade mini holders. This makes it a lot easier for me to hold on to the mini while I'm painting him. I'm going to start off with a lighter gray, and do a dry brushing of all of my gravel. Then I'm going to go over the top of that with a black wash. I like using Nuln Oil from Citadel, but you can use a homemade black wash just as easily. Once I've got a nice even coating of black wash into all of the recesses of the base, I'm going to set him aside to dry. Once the wash has dried, I'm going to come back with that same shade of gray that I just used for dry brushing, but this time I'm going to use a little bit less paint in the brush to have a slightly lighter dry brushing over the top. Then as the final step, I'm going to go back to that black craft paint and my nice wide brush, and I'm going to go around and paint the whole rim a solid black. Then we'll just give him a quick check, make sure we're not missing any bits, and then set him aside to dry. As a bonus option, if you'd like, you can add chains. So for this, I'm just going to grab some jewelry chain that works out to being in scale pretty well, and I'm going to get enough chain to wrap around the mini 2 or 3 times. Then I'm going to grab my super glue and get the cap off so that I can use it one-handed, and starting with one end of my chain, I'm going to hold it in place, draping down the back of my ghost. And once I'm happy with its placement, I'm just going to drip a little bit of super glue right through the links to attach it to the ghost. Then give it just a second to make sure that it's holding, and then working from that connection point, you can start draping the chain around the ghost. And as you're working your way around, just put little drops of super glue and lay your chain across it. Once again, this is something that there really is no right or wrong way to go about it. You just sort of drape it around your ghost until you're happy with the look that you've got. I like to try and make sure that anywhere that my chain touches itself, I add a drop of glue for strength. Oh, and I don't quite like how that hangs there, so I'm just going to pull that back off a little bit and tweak where this is crossing his arm. And I'm just going to use that same tool I was using earlier for our draping to keep from touching the super glue with my fingers. Ah, yeah, there we go, that's better. Lock that down on this side too. And just keep working the chain around the ghost using super glue to connect it anywhere that you think will work. And then when you feel like you have enough chain hanging from your ghost, just clip off the extra. Then give him a quick once over using your super glue and your little paperclip tool to sort of push around any loose chain links and lock down anything that's moving. And once you're happy with him, your chained ghost is all finished. At this point, I do like to take my minis outside and give them a nice coating of a clear matte spray varnish for protection, but that is entirely optional. And as you can see, you get a wide variety of ghost options depending on little tweaks that you make either to the frame and how you put it together, the way that you drape it with the tissue, or the way that you choose to paint it and finish it off. The possibilities are pretty much endless. I'd also like to take a moment here and say a big thank you to my patrons. Your support means the world to me. It is so motivating to know that you guys are enjoying my videos enough to give me a couple bucks a month for it. As a special thank you for my patrons, I am making custom stat blocks for all of the different variations of ghosts that I made in this episode, and I'm putting them up available on Patreon to all of my patrons regardless of level. You guys are really the best. Now that we've taken a look at all of the various ghosts that I've made, let's see how they're gonna look on the table. After a few hours of moving rocks, you clear enough of the cave-in to squeeze through to the cavern on the other side. You find what looks to be the remains of a mining camp. As you search through what was left behind, you begin to hear a low moan. Suddenly, in your midst float 3 pale figures. As they draw closer, you feel a sharp pang of starving hunger. Roll for initiative.
And so there you have it. That is how I make my ghost minis. Tune in for the next episode and I'm going to be showing you how I make my cages. Stick around.
Thanks for spending some of your time here with me at Scattered Terrain. If you liked that video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit that subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.